The last shift has finished. The pumps and drilling rigs have closed down. A graveyard of the oil industry, somewhere in Texas. The experts are divided on just when this will come about, but there's no doubt that it's on its way. The end of the oil era.
Europe is mature. The continental shelves of the world are pretty mature. It means they've been drilled up. The United States has about 8 years production left.
It is pretty clear that at some stage over the next 20 years, production is going to peak.
So it doesn't surprise me that you're going to see a U.S. military, because it is the only superpower status military left in the world, being called upon by the global economy as a whole to go into these situations and try to create stability so that those resources can flow.
And the United States could not operate in foreign areas, in these distant locations, Afghanistan and Iraq, without a large supply of oil, because all of the weapons in the U.S. arsenal and all the transport planes and almost all the ships are powered by petroleum.
For Superpower USA, global access to dwindling resources is a question of national security. More so than ever, now that a competitor in the global hunt for oil has drawn dangerously close: China. Oil, the world's most sought-after drug. In 2004, the price of crude oil reached record heights on the New York commodities market, an event that made the headlines around the world.
Sind weiter auf dem Vormarsch. In den USA wurde ein Barrel Rohöl erstmals über der Marke von $50
auch jetzt wieder da die, wie es heißt, psychologisch wichtige Marke von $50 pro Barrel.
US crude is trading above $50 a barrel.
Le cours du pétrole a franchi un nouveau sommet aujourd'hui, $50,5 le baril à New York.
Bush had a straightforward solution.
George W. Bush, in the throes of an election campaign, promised action.
And it's driving the price like it did in the past. And the President of the United States must jawbone OPEC members to lower the price.
In George W. Bush's Texan hometown, the oil metropolis of Houston, the reaction is not purely one of protest. Spirits are high on the oil industry's executive floors. Record prices mean record income. In 2004, the industry leaders Exxon, BP, Shell and Total chalk up profits of 51 billion euros. And the future for the oil sector is rosy, according to Gene Van Dyke. This independent oil entrepreneur has spent 50 years in a business that, as he says, has brought him a lot of enjoyment and many millions of dollars.
The day of low-price oil is gone.
Forever.
Forever. As I mentioned, it is the first time that the demand for oil has ever exceeded the supply, and the demand is going up a lot faster than new oil is being found. And so the price of oil is not going to go down. And we just, the world has to live with it.
How we see it at Herald is, if you're not enjoying record profits under the current price scenario, then you probably shouldn't be in business. Because at over $50 a barrel and relatively high natural gas prices, you should be enjoying very high cash flow levels. So what you're seeing is, first and foremost, record high profitability, cash flow levels, and really the great challenge for oil and gas companies currently is how to spend this great amount of capital.
They do have a lot of cash flow. But the problem with at least the large companies, they have a lot more cash flow than they have places to drill.
The Gulf of Mexico, off the coast of Texas, just a few kilometers away from Houston, is one of the places people are pinning a lot of hopes on. Van Dyke thinks that offshore, under the sea, is the only area that still holds promise of success in the search for new, large-scale oil deposits.
We're here at about, we're about 10 to 12 miles offshore now, off the coast by Galveston, Texas. This is really where the offshore oil business really began, all along the Texas-Louisiana Gulf Coast. And we're only in about 100 feet of water here or so. And the oil industry really, in the last 50 years, has been going in progressively deeper water. Now they're drilling in depths of 8, even 10,000 feet of water. 3,000 meters is common because they simply have tapped all the oil that is available here close to shore.
The amount of oil coming from the Gulf of Mexico covers only a fraction of demand. More than half the oil needed by the USA now comes from other countries.
It has to import increasing amounts of oil because domestic production is falling and consumption is rising. So what this has meant is what we're seeing now in Iraq, which is, in short, that America's foreign policy and America's energy policy have merged so that they can't be separated. America is in the Persian Gulf because it doesn't have an energy policy, and we're in the Persian Gulf because we can't stay away. This is the future of America's foreign policy, America's military policy for the next 2 decades.
The familiar picture in Houston. The price at the pumps has risen to about half the price in Germany, and motorists are indignant. But no one's prepared to do without their automobile. America leads the world in per capita energy consumption as well.
Right now in the U.S., there are about 200 million vehicles on the road. So even if George W. Bush woke up tomorrow and had some, conversion, some radical idea that he is going to change the way America deals with transportation, bringing on new hybrids or more efficient cars won't have a dramatic effect until virtually all of those cars are replaced. And that's a multi-trillion-dollar cost that will take decades.
But so far, no radical changes are in sight. The challenge of growing demand is met by increasing imports.
It may be 10 years down the line, 15 years down the line, maybe it's 25. But a paradigm shift of this magnitude, shifting away from the West's reliance on oil as its energy source for transportation and as an industrial input, is a colossal task. And no, I don't see anyone really coming up with well-thought-out means of addressing the intellectual and economic capital that will be required to address this issue.
One of the leading experts and author of the standard work on black gold is Daniel Yergin. Oil, he believes, is first and foremost an intrinsic element of national power, the ownership of which gives rise to conflicts and wars.
The answer is to diversify the sources of production so that there will be crises, there will be problems. We've seen it over the last few years, how problems in Nigeria or in Russia or in Venezuela can affect the world oil market. And the answer, the only answer that we've really found to deal with that political risk, and that's whether you're a company or whether you're the world community, is through diversified resources. Don't be too dependent on one part of the world.
We need to recognize that the primary resources of this world lie outside of the United States and even North America. That many of these countries that we will rely on our energy needs are in very politically, economically, and socially risky areas. Looking at Africa, Middle East.
60% of the world's oil reserves lie in the Middle East. The second biggest portion of that in Iraq. Among the first objectives for American forces in the last Gulf War were Iraq's oil fields. But the calculation that access could be secured didn't work out.
I think one of the bitter ironies about George W. Bush's decision to invade Iraq, despite the many thousands of deaths and so on, is that it really hasn't given the U.S. any more control over that oil, but it has increased the U.S. military presence in the Persian Gulf, and now the U.S. has no choice but to stay in the Persian Gulf for the foreseeable future.
Even with the war over, hardly a week goes by in Iraq without attacks on drilling installations and pipelines. U.S. military presence can't prevent them. A situation which is not without repercussions. The Gulf War has left the oil market more nervous and the price more volatile than before, and has pushed up America's oil consumption.
I just found numbers from the Pentagon that indicate that they're now consuming, the 140,000 troops in Iraq are consuming about 1.9 million gallons of fuel per day, and all of it has to be imported into Iraq. And so, you know, from a strategic standpoint for the U.S. military, it's a terrible situation.
Houston is dependent on the drug oil. Without it, the refineries on the outskirts of the city would close down, in the second largest petrochemical complex in the world. The question of Washington's strategies for securing adequate oil imports in the future is nowhere of more interest than here.
And we have to talk about Vice President Dick Cheney, because in this area, I think it's Dick Cheney who's the principal strategist in the administration. And I think he understands very well that increased U.S. dependence on imported oil will put the United States at greater risk, both of terrorism or involvement in local conflicts, and therefore we have to have a bigger, more powerful capacity for what they call power projection, for intervention in the developing world. And this has been the hallmark of the Bush-Cheney military policy from the very beginning.
Dick Cheney became U.S. Vice President straight from the executive floor of the world's biggest service provider for oil companies and the armed forces, Halliburton. In his new office, he presented George W. Bush with a paper laying down the guidelines for America's energy policy in the decades ahead.
They project a 50% increase in U.S. oil consumption over the next 25 years. And that really is a very tough requirement to fill. It will mean a substantial increase in U.S. imports of oil from foreign countries. So procuring all of this additional imported oil is one of the primary concerns of the Bush-Cheney Energy Report. In fact, 1/3, 35 out of 105 recommendations in the Cheney Report are specifically about increasing America's access to imported petroleum.
The key message. The report recommends that the President make energy security a priority of our trade and foreign policy.
The Bush administration does not have a strategy other than invade the oil-producing countries and militarize the oil-producing regions and the oil choke points. That has been the thrust of all of Bush's policy so far. And you see it now in the Strait of Hormuz. You see it in the Strait of Malacca. You see it in Panama, in the Suez. The U.S. now is the military's sole goal around the world has become to militarize the choke points and to militarize the oil-producing countries that are friendly to the U.S. And I think that trend is clearly going to continue.
The report also sets its sights on a new oil region. Along with Latin America, West Africa is expected to be one of the fastest growing sources of oil and gas for the American market.
I think if people took the trouble to read this report, and unfortunately not enough people have read the report to its conclusion, but if you did read it, you would see that it does serve as a blueprint for American foreign policy. It says that the duty of the President and the Vice President and the Secretary of State and Energy and Commerce must be to increase their diplomacy in oil-producing countries, to work with foreign governments to overcome barriers to greater investment by the United States, to bring in American companies with new technology to increase the output of oil. And on this basis, the Secretary of State, Colin Powell, has made several trips to Africa, for example, to meet with the heads of state of the oil-producing countries to persuade them to increase their oil output, to work more closely with the United States. The president has also become involved in this diplomacy, so it's very clear that the Cheney report did serve as a blueprint for American foreign policy.
And for the foreign visits of the president. George W. Bush on a voyage of discovery. The destination, Africa, a previously largely neglected territory. The schedule included a photo opportunity with AIDS orphans in Uganda. An opportunity, too, for the visitor to declare that his chief concern was to help Africa in the struggle against disease and poverty. The tour had nothing to do with oil. That was a ridiculous conspiracy theory, Bush had told reporters in Washington before setting off. And Condoleezza Rice added,
"It is the motherland, a source of cultural pride for a substantial part of America's population, and the president cares about that."
The United States believes in the great potential of Africa.
The greatest potential, the Niger Delta in southern Nigeria. The country is fifth in the list of oil exporters to the USA. There was no question of it being missed out of the African tour of the American president. And George W. Bush counted himself lucky, as he put it, to have Nigeria's head of state as a friend.
For a long time. I appreciate your leadership, and I appreciate your friendship. Thank you very much.
The experts at the CSIS think tank in Washington are agreed. A key role is now being allotted to West Africa in America's bid to achieve greater independence from oil supplies from the Middle East.
Today, West Africa accounts for 13 or 14% of U.S. oil imports because of new discoveries and expanding production that are going to bring on stream another 2 to 3 million barrels per day from that region in the next 5 years. U.S. imports from West Africa could exceed 20%, could reach 25%.
West Africa has become a very important, exciting area, whether you're an American company, whether you're a European company, or whether you're a Japanese or indeed a Chinese company. They're all there wanting to be part of that production growth.
The Gulf of Guinea, situated between the USA and the west coast of Africa, a tropical paradise. The island state of São Tomé, the second smallest African country. Largely forgotten by the rest of the world since the withdrawal of its colonizer, Portugal, a quarter of a century ago. The plantations in the interior, just a reminder now of more opulent days, when São Tomé was the biggest cocoa producer in the world. There hasn't been any big money to be made from cocoa beans for quite some time, but now a new source of wealth is beckoning.
São Tomé is a tiny country. It's a microstate, only 140,000 citizens. It's had a very poor, impoverished history. Suddenly it appears that São Tomé likely has between 4 and 10 billion barrels of oil. It's at the early point of putting out concessions for exploration on these reserves. It is likely to become very wealthy in the next 5 to 10 years, and will bring on stream a new source of oil. Exactly at what level? Is it 300,000 barrels a day? Is it 500,000 or a million barrels a day? That remains to be seen.
The news worked wonders. Overnight, this forgotten microstate became the focus of international interest. Business was booming for the best hotel. One of the first guests was the then Africa expert of the George W. Bush administration.
We tried to raise the level of interest and to demonstrate why this continent has such an important role in the future for Europe, America, for the whole world.
If you say important role, has it come into focus mainly because of oil?
I think oil has helped. There are a lot of other issues, of course, that grab the attention of policymakers, be it HIV/AIDS, increasing trade, working at increasing investment flows to Africa. All of those things are very important, as is protecting the environment. Those unique ecosystems of Africa need to be assisted and protected. But definitely oil, in realpolitik terms, does play a part of increasing Africa's importance to all of us.
In the island republic in the Gulf of Guinea, there's only one topic of interest at the moment.
Tout le monde à Sao Tomé ne parle que du pétrole. Bon, l'expérience a montré, lorsqu'on regarde tous les pays africains qui ont déjà eu le pétrole, ça n'a jamais été, la gestion n'a jamais été tout à fait comme les gens l'espèrent. Donc, vu cette expérience, je pense que ça ne va pas être ce que les gens attendent.
We're an hour and a half's flying time away on the west coast of the continent, in Douala, the business centre of Cameroon. Even from the hotel pool, you can't fail to notice the place is in the grip of oil fever. The hotel's fully booked, the lobbies overflowing. There are 2 conferences being held today by American oil concerns. The whole of the coastal sweep of West Africa, from Ivory Coast, Nigeria and Equatorial Guinea to Angola, has become an oil dorado. Interested parties are flooding in from around the world, from America to China. It's the Africans, for once, that everybody's interested in. Shortly after dawn, women are arriving from the opposite bank to sell firewood in the city. In most cases, the money this brings in is the family's sole income. Idyllic to the eyes of foreign visitors, a hard daily grind for the women themselves. 3/4 of the 9 million people living in Chad in Central Africa exist on less than 90 cents a day. From the west coast of Africa to the interior of the continent, to N'Djamena, the capital of the Republic of Chad. One of the world's poorest countries, bearing the scars of 30 years of war. It's hoped that petrodollars will transform this country too. Street vendors are still doing good business selling petroleum by the bottle, smuggled in from neighboring Nigeria. But the aim is to replace this at some point by cheap fuel from the country's own refinery. Hopes are focused on the south of the country, on the Doba Basin near the border with Cameroon. Gas flares on the horizon, symbols of the new age. They've been extracting oil here for 2 years or so and pumping it through an underground pipeline for more than 1,000 kilometers to the Cameroon coast. Developing the oil fields, the biggest investment to date in Africa south of the Sahara. A $3 billion project supported by the World Bank and involving chiefly the American oil concerns of ExxonMobil and Chevron. Responsible for implementing the project is the subsidiary company Esso. And the exploration phase is not yet complete. The search for new oil fields is being extended to other regions, including some that are more densely populated, where farmers cultivate fields and plantations. To gain their support and explain what the future has in store for them, teams of American experts are doing the rounds. The target today, a village way out in the bush, huts either side of the dirt track. The inhabitants don't know what's going on. A few minutes after the last of the vehicles has drawn up, the SO team take over. The village elder is summoned and asked to gather together the most important people in the village, but only them. Then the expert makes his appearance. Last-minute preparations, expectantly followed by everyone.
The reason the project is here is that ESSO wants to look deep into the earth to see if there is more petroleum in the earth below.
La raison de ceci est ESSO de pour passer pétrole dans le ciné assez godor.
And to do that, they have brought big machines that will move through the vegetation and take a picture of the earth below, of the rocks way down in the earth. And then they will know if there is sufficient oil to maybe in the future develop a project. Maybe there is no oil, maybe there is, but that is what we are here to find out.
We ask around and no one seems to have any objections. Quite the opposite.
Si le pétrole, ça existe le Tchad, tout le monde sera bien et développé.
Oui. Ça vous plaît s'il vient ici?
Oui, ça nous plaît beaucoup. Quand la recherche du pétrole arrive, il trouve quelque chose, ça nous convient. Tous les enfants du Tchad, nous serons riches.
Ah oui. Vous êtes d'accord si on vient ici pour chercher du pétrole?
Si vous venez pour chercher le pétrole, c'est le bien que le pétrole nous arrive. Le pétrole va nous amener du bien pour le Tchad et pour les autres pays aussi.
A few kilometers away, a camp of geologists. They've marked out a new section of land. In their search for new oil deposits, they use ultra-modern equipment to sound out the land square meter by square meter.
After this one, we will go 103, and we will do 102, 104, 106, then move to the other area. The last season, earlier in this year, we were crossing this river with the vehicles. At the moment, it's impossible.
How promising is it for you, to find oil here?
Well, I believe it's quite promising. I believe we have a lot of areas which are unexplored in this area. We are actually working on an area where work been done on the previous season, previous years. And what we do now is more detailed image of the underground of the.
The data gathered from the explorations are sent via satellite direct to the laboratory at headquarters in America's oil metropolis, Houston. There, they're evaluated by experts, but even they can't be 100% certain that what they see on the screen represents an oil layer.
If we do find hydrocarbons, they should be here in this crustal zone. In this reflector package, you see these bright reflectors kind of dimming out over the crest of this feature. This is one likely place to find hydrocarbons.
Oil entrepreneur Gene Van Dyke estimates the chances of deep-sea drilling striking it lucky in Africa at about 50-50. The only region worth trying, he thinks, is off the west coast of Africa. He's currently represented in 7 countries, with the focus on explorations in the Gulf of Guinea, activities which Washington is happy to support.
The U.S. government is becoming a lot more cognizant of the value of production from that area. And so they do help. I do keep in close contact. I have a lobbyist in Washington, D.C. We keep close contact with the government.
The capital investment needed for developing a large new oil field is somewhere near €2 billion, according to Van Dyke. For his latest exploration, he's teamed up with Washington's toughest competition. A Chinese company is involved in the financing. Investing capital in a politically relatively insecure region like Africa is not viewed as risky by Van Dyke.
There's a difference between being onshore, being on the shelf, and being in deep water. If you're in deep water, you're far enough out there where they really don't bother you. You're out of sight. You're not dependent upon onshore because your deep water platforms or facilities are completely independent of what's going on onshore. And so you're really not bothered by if there is a change of government, the new government wants the income that comes from your oil. You take countries like Angola, they've had a civil war for basically about 25 years, and it's never affected their offshore activity, which is increasing all the time.
Cabinda, Angola's oil enclave on the Gulf of Guinea. Traditionally one source for meeting America's oil needs. But since early 2005, the Chinese have been gaining ground here too. The Angolan government has signed a contract guaranteeing oil deliveries to Peking and granting concessions for future drilling operations. The global race for oil has become riskier. The U.S. Naval War College in Newport. One of the professors here is among the most influential strategists in American military planning and was involved in the recent restructuring of the U.S. Armed Forces. He believes there's a region of risk stretching from Asia via the Middle East to Africa, an area of danger that has to be eradicated. This is the argument in his book, The Pentagon's New Map.
Does this mean more wars? No, I think it requires the United States in many ways to bring a Europe, a Russia, a developing Asia into the reality that the United States has been dealing with across this non-integrating gap for the last 15 years. We have been intervening in 10 or 12 situations every year for the last 15 years. That's how you get those 150 interventions. And in many ways what we need to do is to move off the model that says the U.S. does all the military interventions, maybe we get the Europeans to do the peacekeeping afterwards, and maybe we get the Japanese to pay for it.
A form of cooperation already tried out in the Horn of Africa. Here the Americans asked for the support of the German Navy, officially in the battle against terrorism. But critics say that this battle is often indistinguishable from the protection of American oil interests.
The term I use is it's being transformed into a global oil protection service. That is, that more and more the military is being devoted to the protection of overseas oil fields, refineries, pipelines, loading facilities, and tanker lanes. Now, I should say that historically the United States has always had a big military presence in the Persian Gulf area, and that's always been for the purpose of protecting oil. That goes back decades. But what I argue in my book is that that same principle is being extended to other areas of the world where the United States looks for its petroleum, to Latin America, Africa, and the Caspian Sea basin.
In order to avoid creating such an onerous burden where you're going in and trying to police, like an entire continent of Africa, I would argue at first you're going to try to go in and deal with the worst situations and display a flexibility and what we call a small footprint, not coming in with a massive force, but coming in with a small force to do things that need to be done and then withdrawing. Over time, I think what you want to create is a long-term military-to-military cooperation program or system of programs that would allow a NATO and a United States military to come in and create, as much as possible, stable, functioning militaries that respond to civilian control by good governments there.
And this is happening, the Star-Spangled Banner in the desert sands. US soldiers on maneuver on West African soil with African troops.
Mine 607-614-7007. McKnight.
Military cooperation treaties make it possible. The Pentagon's official interpretation, training provision for African soldiers, exporting democracy to the dark continent. Pure coincidence that the maneuver is taking place in West Africa.
Oil certainly, I think, is the main reason for U.S. interest in Africa right now. Certainly the Department of Defense says that it has achieved a strategic importance because of the oil there, but it is also a site for terrorist organizations have located in the area. So it's a combination of terrorism and oil that's bringing the United States in. And by the way, that's a combination that appears in many places. In Colombia, it's oil and terrorism. In Georgia, it's oil and terrorism. These two things tend to come together in many parts of the world.
In Sao Tome, it's just oil so far. America's presence is currently restricted to an outsized relay station for the Voice of America. Strange, though, that more and more soldiers are being seen here, say the locals. They suspect that the Pentagon could also be making use of the site, that there may be plans in Washington's Defense Department to set up a naval base in Sao Tome. Nothing but rumors, according to the first official visit to Sao Tome from America's State Department.
We were not, although there was great speculation in the press that that was, in fact, the very reason we were there. No, we did not discuss that. There is a maritime, West Africa Maritime Patrol, like a Coast Guard, what we would call a Coast Guard program, that we were trying to initiate with the Pentagon, and that would include some of the West Coast maritime areas, including San Tome. So we did look at if there were some coastal patrol training we could do. But on the security or military side, that was about the extent of it.
But as I know, General Carlton Fulford was there at the same time. I think it wasn't just for a holiday trip.
General Fulford was, I don't think it was there when I was
2001, I think it was, yes.
And I think he was doing a tour, and partially because this maritime coastal patrol, this Coast Guard, obviously needs Pentagon input, we at the State Department encouraged European Command to go take a look.
The Persian Gulf. Historically, it began with the U.S. sending military advisors and sending weapons, arms transfers, military advisors, military instructors, and expanding over time to the establishment of bases and the deployment of troops permanently in the area. So there's a trajectory you could see in the Middle East. Well, that same trajectory is being followed now in the Caspian Sea. First, military advisors and the supply of weapons. Now the United States is establishing permanent military facilities in the Caspian Sea. We also have American troops in Georgia, and at a lower level, but moving along quickly, a U.S. military buildup in Africa, which is becoming more and more important for the supply of oil. So you have military advisors, no bases yet, but the Department of Defense is looking at locations in Africa to establish bases.
The alarm bells have been ringing for the American military since an internal study claimed that rival China is also trying to extend its strategic position in the race for resources. According to the study, Peking is setting up new naval bases and airstrips in an apparent bid to secure petroleum transports from the Persian Gulf.
Most of the growth in consumption is going to come from Asia. Already since the year 2000, something like 40% of the total growth in world oil demand has come from one country, China.
I worry that in the competitive pursuit of foreign oil, that especially the United States and China might clash in the Caspian Sea region, where both of them are looking for oil. Now, I wouldn't argue that this would be through intentional policy. I'm not saying that they seek to go to war with one another, but both of them are seeking allies in the region and providing military advisors, sending weapons into the area, building new military ties with local powers in a competitive way that is very reminiscent of the period before World War I in the Balkans, when you had the big powers all competing for advantage in a very volatile area.
Competition that's long been evident in Africa too. The new oil dorado that America's banking on to secure its supplies. 25% of US oil imports are expected to come from the reserves of the Dark Continent in future. That's more than America receives from Saudi Arabia. In Chad, the latest member of the Club of African Oil Countries, American oil companies dominate the scene. They built the oil wells and the pipeline through which oil now flows over 1,000 kilometers to the Atlantic coast in Cameroon and out to the loading terminal at sea. But now the USA's rival, China, has claimed rights and is negotiating with the government of Chad for access to the precious resource oil. Submerged in the race of the great players, the hopes of the fishermen. No petrodollars for them, just a ban on their fishing in the bay, as they used to before the loading terminal dropped anchor, at a safe distance from the African coast.